I have seen things that will stay with me for the rest of my days. Welcome, everyone, to Male Fuzz TV. I am Peter, and today I'm going to be talking about Station 11, Episode 9. It's called Dr. Chaudhary. So, spoilers for the episode. This is a sponsored review from Patreon. Thank you to Allison for picking this show. So, this is a Jeevan focused flashback, which doesn't so much tell the story of how they got to the cabin. That's just kind of glossed over for the most part. And it's more about how that time ended. It's more about how he left Kirsten and what actually happened there. Obviously, in the past, I might have just assumed, oh, maybe he met a demise of some kind for something. Or maybe he ran away. In fact, the episode even kind of teases that by bringing up that he had this old nickname of Leavin' Jeevan, which is funny. But yeah, it ends up being kind of a weird, quirky, emotional but quirky story that actually unfolds here, which I quite liked actually for the most part. If anything, this might even be the best episode in some ways. There's kind of some nuance to this one that makes it feel like it's doing some interesting things. There's some stuff that reminded me of the tone of the leftovers, which I guess in some ways this show has been kind of trying to hit that at points, but I really felt it in this one, was the tone from that show. It's a good episode. I think it's like a lot of the episodes that have been set in the past, it's very focused, it's got a clear goal, it's a good character study of Jeevan and the end of his story. It's also got some good little moments for Kirsten, and just some nice stylistic moments and ideas that it kind of like uses to great effect in the same way that a lot of these flashback episodes have. So feel pretty good about this, and it probably hit me a little bit more emotionally than I think even any of the other episodes have done, even the one in the apartment from a couple of episodes ago. And I don't know why that is necessarily. Maybe I just found the story here a little bit more engaging, perhaps. Maybe it's because that episode was destined to just end with Kirsten and Jeevan leaving Frank in some way, so I knew it was coming to an end. And while this episode starts with that kind of feeling, because we know Jeevan's going to leave Kirsten, it goes way beyond that, and we see kind of what happens to Jeevan. Part of it also just might be that Jeevan and young Kirsten are the two characters that I care the most about. So them having this kind of breakdown, this falling out, and then it kind of inadvertently just happened to be the night that he ends up leaving her, which is not his choice, right? We find out in this episode this is something that's out of his control, and it just kind of like spirals from there, and that's it. He never sees her again. But it is telling, and this could be really setting me up for disappointment here, because I'm not saying I expect this. I'm not saying that I think the show is telling me this is going to happen, because I don't think it necessarily is. But I will say that after this episode, I think the thing in this show, narratively get into the final episode, because this is the penultimate episode, the thing I care the most about is Jeevan and Kirsten reuniting. And I don't know if that's going to happen. Thematically, it might even make more sense for it not to happen. But I care way more about their relationship than I do anything going on with Tyler and the Prophet stuff. And, like, last episode, like, even though I liked all the airport stuff when they sort of built that society, by the time we got to the last episode, it kind of felt like, there was so many characters with motivations all over the place, and it wasn't particularly like hitting that well, where I was like really behind what some of the characters were doing. Here, everything was landing, and when I finished this episode, and where Jeevan ends up at the end, where he is alive in present day, he has kids, he's effectively married, he's a doctor now. No one officially made him that, of course, but just this idea that he kind of faked his way in the role, and then now he does actually go and visit patients. He's become that. He's become a carer of some kind. And in many ways, he started this show as caring for Kirsten, and it's kind of like come from that. He's now helping other people, which is kind of sweet and kind of a really nice sort of ending destination for him. But of course, there is this lingering thing of he obviously is always going to worry about what's happened to Kirsten, where she's went. He has to accept that she's moved on, and that's tough for him. But he's always going to wonder, and he's probably always going to feel bad that the last time he spoke to her, he yelled at her, and it was this moment of conflict. It wasn't this kind of like, oh, just any other night. It was a night where she had even been questioning, are you going to leave? And she brings up that nickname, Leaving Jeevan. Like, it's not that fight, it's like earlier that day or the day before she brings that up. But it's this idea that he leaves, that he doesn't commit to people, he abandons them, maybe because he's scared of losing them, and that kind of fits into the themes of the show. One of the things that I thought was really smart is, and what I really liked is, probably some of my favorite post-apocalyptic stuff is in this episode, and it's just him and her together at the start of the episode, and seeing that she's learned to hunt properly. She's in a rifle. Maybe it's because it made me think of The Last of Us, because it's very Last of Us, having the young girl using a rifle and shooting deer or whatever else it might be. But they have this system where he goes to check the houses and she's on watch. That leads to some conflict because she ends up being distracted. She has a real problem reading the book. She keeps reading Station 11 when she's supposed to be doing other things, and it actually gets Jeevan into a bit of trouble. So that might hint or suggest why she kind of hid the book somewhere and left it behind at a certain point. Maybe she realized it was a problem. Maybe she's addicted to going back to the book instead of focusing on the world around her and the people she's supposed to be getting close to and so on. Maybe she's actually learned that lesson here. And in some ways, Kirsten might even feel like she's at blame because they had this fight over the book. In fact, Jeevan was out trying to find the book again because he threw it out of her bag when she wasn't looking on the way back from the house, which puts into context that scene we got in a previous episode where she goes and finds the book herself in the snow, and I think sees some blood maybe in the snow. I think we saw that at that time. But anyway, no, all this stuff was compelling to watch. It was kind of simple post-apocalyptic stuff, but because they were working together as a team and because I'm invested in these two characters, like him going through the house and like occasionally saying something to her over the walkie-talkie when she's on watch, like a sniper, effectively, was entertaining. And honestly, like, I think the moments here, and this is kind of ironic given who this person ends up being, but the person who shows up and like hits him with a beanbag gun or whatever it is, they actually, I think, cause more menace to me, or made me feel more menace. Particularly after his, like, the wolf attack, when he's like crawling back to the house and he's not quite getting there, and this woman in the little motorbike with a sidecar comes up and takes him back to the department store. But that moment when she's coming up in the bike, like, did feel quite imposing. It was like, oh, he kind of was lucky to like fight her off last time, right? Because Kirsten didn't respond and didn't shoot at her like he said. And even that's kind of like darkly, not ironic, that's not the right word for it, but the idea that he was yelling, Kirsten, shoot her, and then this ends up being a woman he seemingly is spending his life with and having kids with later in the episode. Like, what could have been if Kirsten had actually listened to him in that moment? So I guess fate has a way of making things work out. But when he's looking through the house, and the big thing in the house, and this again made me think of other post-apocalyptic shows, is the idea of finding the remnants of who used to be here, right? So he finds a keyboard that's programmed with sounds of children, and it turns out to be the sounds of the children who lived here. And it's later on Jeevan kind of expresses his interpretation of what he's found here. The end of this scene, it reveals that the skeleton on the couch, right, presumably the father in this house. And Jeevan explains later that what he seems to think is that the people in this house died, but the dad died later than everyone else. Like, the wife and the kids were all in their beds and they died there, but it seems like the dad was alive for a while, that he survived. Maybe he didn't get sick, or maybe he did, or he just chose to let himself die because he'd lost his whole family. But before he died, he'd made this kind of, he programmed the keyboard with all these sounds of his children so he could kind of hear their voices again. He could play like words and kind of form parts of a conversation, maybe. And that's fitting directly into the themes of this show, for one, because so much of this show is about saying goodbye and how we remember people and how we get over them, whether or not we can. It also fits into the theme of using art in some way. I mean, calling this music's a little bit of a stretch, but it's an instrument and he's using it in that way. So it kind of fits into that theme as well. And then for this episode specifically, it's this interesting bit of foreshadowing, because by the end of the episode, like, it's almost like this is the sort of thing Jeevan's scared of happening if he ever lets himself have a family, if he ever lets himself have children and care about people that much. And by the end of this episode, he has learned to care about people that much. He does have his own kids. He does seem to have a family life. You know, he seems to have named one of his sons Frank based on the end of the episode. So after his brother, of course. So all of this was great, like foreshadowing, especially in hindsight when I was thinking back to this stuff, and like just how it sort of made me think of these themes, of this idea of how he feels about finding this kind of scenario. And a big part of this episode is him kind of letting go of Kirsten and moving on, which is tough. He feels responsible for her, of course. He wants to get back to her. But of course, the question, because I wasn't sure what the tone was going to be once this stuff properly got going, as I wheel myself in a little bit, forgive the noise. But when it was, you know, when he wakes up in this, what turns out to be a big department store, right? And he's in the bed section, and he's lying in one of the beds, and this woman comes up. And then the one thing I've left out here, of course, is that there was a moment early on in the episode where he was on a ham radio that he found back in the apartments, and he ends up talking to someone who says they're near the water, and he just kind of lies and says that he's a doctor because he doesn't know what to say. And he sees the Doctor 11 like jacket that was made for the play, which he's still been wearing, and says that he's a doctor. And that's what they want. And this is why this woman comes looking for him, actually. And I think we assume when we hear that, or most people probably assume, oh, someone's hurt, someone's injured, and now he said he's a doctor, they're going to want help. But what it turns out to be is that this department store is full of pregnant women, like a dozen maybe, and one doctor, one lady who's a doctor and wants another doctor to help. And Jeevan does very quickly say when he's lying here on the bed that he's not a doctor. And this woman, who name's Terry, although I think later she says her real name is Deborah, but Terry was her husband's name that she sort of took, again, to remember someone she lost, right? Again, it's this idea of how do we keep people around after the fact. And I imagine for a lot of these pregnant women, they get to keep their, I mean, some of them, they may not have all been in loving relationships, but some of them probably were, and they might get to keep their partners alive in some form through their children, because now they literally have a biological offshoot of them. But again, those themes keep coming back. But the Terry just leans in and says, yes, you are. Like, I don't care if you're not actually a doctor, but you are now. We need one. And I wasn't really sure, because like Terry was giving me kind of these weird vibes where I'm like, is he been held captive here? Is she, like, she says obviously quite quickly that this, you know, I think it's the next time she talks to him that she's sorry about the amputation, and we find out that he's lost half of his foot from these bites of the wolf, or I think he maybe even shot his own foot. You know, it was in the dark, the wolf attack. It was quite well done, but he's lying there, and it's obviously kind of traumatic to see this. But as they're dealing with other things, he basically like sees the wheelchair that they've put next to his bed for him, and he tries to make a run for it. He just, you know, puts on his jacket, he gets on the chair, and he wheels to the exit. And the shutters are down, like the sort of security shutters inside the glass windows and doors. But there's a pregnant woman standing out there, and she sees him and sees that he wants to leave, and she just unlocks it for him to let him go. Of course, as soon as she does, the snow comes like blowing in, and like I'm thinking, how far are you going to get on this in this wheelchair in this weather at this time of year? Like, it doesn't seem very feasible. But of course, as he's leaving, he sees a pregnant woman walking towards the building, someone who has heard of this place that's looking after pregnant women, and she collapses. So next time we see Jeevan, he's put her on the chair, and he's hobbling along and pushing her in and saying, hey, this woman needs help. He can't help but help. Like, that's Jeevan's character. He just does it, and he ends up being here. And you know, it's all building up to winter solstice. I mean, if I have a slight critique of this stuff, is that this idea that Terry believes that they're all going to give birth in the same day on winter solstice is a little bit kind of like weird and gimmicky. One woman does give birth before then, and they kind of celebrate it a little bit, but most of them do give birth on that same day, which is a bit coincidental. But it was actually that scene, funnily enough, that made me think of The Leftovers tonally. It really felt like a Leftovers-y style thing. But with Leftovers, whenever they did something like that, it was kind of like, oh, is this divine intervention that this is all happening at the same time? This is actually some kind of proof or evidence that there is a being above that's looking down on us and causing things and it has a plan or whatever. That's less of a, well, I mean, there's a little bit of that in this show, but it's not like the focus of the show. Certainly, it's not the sole thing going on. As this plays out, though, it's clear that they're not keeping him here by force, right? If he wants to try and leave, he can, but he sees that they need help. He obviously, like, one of the things that comes up though that makes him not still feel like he has to get back to Kirsten immediately is that the woman who brought him here, who has turned out his name Lara, when he's lying in bed the first time he wakes up and he starts muttering, there's a 9-year-old girl at the cabin, there's a 9-year-old girl, I have to get back to her. And immediately Lara has this look in her face of concern and like clearly feels like, oh no, if I left a kid alone by taking him here. And we find out the next time they speak that as soon as he said that, she left and went and checked. She went to the cabin and she looked inside and there was no Kirsten there. She didn't find anyone. So it's already kind of like suggested to him that she's moved on already in some ways. She might come back. Maybe she didn't leave for good. Maybe she was just out hunting, foraging, whatever it may be. But it's enough that like he can at least heal a little bit, right? Because this is the thing. He's still getting better from this injury. He just had half his foot cut off. He's struggling with that. He's going to be using a walking stick for the rest of his life. So he's getting used to all that, but of course he ends up helping the people here, and it's clear that Lara like tries to like get him into the groove, like because they're all celebrating after the first woman gives birth like a little bit early, and they're all dancing. They're all pregnant women, which there is kind of a surreal quality to like pretty much all being pregnant women who are looking after each other, especially when they're all going to be giving birth at the same time. I think one of the lines in this episode that really stuck out to me. Perhaps you could argue the entire setup is a little contrived, but the line that Lara says where I know I'm in labor but I can still help is a really funny line, because they're all in that boat, right? All of them but two, and that's Jeevan and Terry the doctor, and it's during the little party part where he goes over to her and talks to her, and we find out the reason why she's still alive, because she is a doctor, but she did have her medical license taken away because she was running some kind of, I don't know, racket with some orderlies at a hospital, and she got fired, her license got taken away. But that's the reason why she's still alive, because she's like one of the only doctors on the planet who was not dealing with patients when the virus was spreading. So all the doctors are pretty much all dead. There may be one or two like her that somehow didn't end up there, but because she wasn't allowed to practice as a doctor anymore, she was at home, didn't die, and now she's here, and she's one of the only people who can do this stuff. And it's funny because she tells Jeevan that, hey, most of the job is just willing to be there and like be there when someone's dying. It's worth mentioning that Jeevan is flashing to like Frank's death throughout the episode a number of times, and he's talking to Frank as well. In numerous points throughout the episode where we actually see Frank walking alongside him, that kind of thing. Obviously this was teased last time where he talked about the voices, or Kirsten said he started talking to himself before we even got to the cabin. So that was all set up from before. But I was thinking though, I don't know if that's entirely true, that's what most of the job is. I feel like some medical know-how would probably go a long way. But yeah, and clearly he's thrown into the deep end where he ends up running around, holding things, helping the pregnant woman get to a bed or somewhere they can give birth, and he's running around. It's a very crazy scene, and the music stuck out to me a lot in this episode as well, because there's the music here I can't even remember enough to describe, but there was a very kind of like weird upbeat thing early on in the episode as well, when him and Kirsten were hunting and whatnot. But this is the scene with the visual that I think everyone who watches this episode is going to remember. It's going to be burned in their brain, and that is that there's a shot of a woman giving birth, like the actual birth, like as in the baby's coming out of the vagina, and we can see it. It's also, I mean, it caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting it. It's not something I typically expect a movie or TV show to cut to. Uh, I get it in the context of the scene, that this is obviously the first time Jeevan's probably seeing this because he's not a doctor. He's not running around delivering babies. So the shock to the system that this is meant to shock you alongside the character, and I get that. What's weird about it for me is that it made me think of an old movie that I reviewed over on the movie channel on the Atomic Cinema Experiment, an old English sci-fi movie called No Blade of Grass, which is also a post-apocalyptic movie, funnily enough. But that movie actually had a birthing scene where there was a similar close-up of the actual birth, and that footage in that movie was real. They actually went to like a hospital and got a pregnant woman to like, hey, can we have permission to film this so we can insert it as if you're like you're basically the body double for the actress playing the part in the rest of the movie. But the shot of the baby coming out was a real birth in that movie, and that was pretty scarring. I'm sure this is faked. My assumption would be that this was artificial in some way. I don't know how they did it. A prosthetic of some kind, I assume, but I don't know. Maybe they went in the distance. Maybe they got a real pregnant woman to let them film that. I mean, I doubt it, but who knows? I'm sure there's some trivia online, given that people probably talked about this shot. It definitely sticks with you. It's definitely one that you'll remember after you've watched it. Like I said, it does kind of, like this episode, it's very much about Jeevan remembering all the people he's lost, his brother, his sister, who was a doctor as well. That comes up in the conversation with Terry. Like, so much of this show is about remembering people we've lost, and often because they've died. And here he is at the start of new life. This is like him getting a chance to witness new lives be born. This is kind of the start of a new generation. This is, what things can be rather than what we've already lost. And it's not without its sadness. The woman who was at the door who let him out initially, she's waiting for someone called Dave. And I actually got the impression that Dave wasn't the father of her baby, because the way she talks about him, it kind of sounded like she met him after the the start of the apocalypse, right? Because they talk about how we need new words for the last person you met before the apocalypse and the first person you met after the apocalypse. And this was actually maybe the one thing in the episode I didn't quite like, was that this Dave turned out to be young Tyler. It's only a small scene, he's there briefly and he leaves. It's not like super, taken away from the episode or anything like that. But it was a bit cute. It's a bit like, oh, everything's connected, everyone's crossed paths before. Even he crosses paths into Jeevan's story a little bit. I could have done without that, honestly. But regardless of that, though, I get maybe symbolically the idea that he's here when his character's whole thing is that there was no before. He even says it again in this episode. But this idea that these babies are representing the new, that these are the post-pandemic babies that are into this new world, that don't remember the world from before. So having him in a scene where he even gets to hold a baby and kind of understands that, especially since that's maybe a bunch of babies he recruits in a few years, given all the kids that he works with. All of this is nice. I think another scene that people will probably be mad at me if I don't bring up is the hug, which I think was before the big birth scene, actually. I think that it was maybe during the party or just after the party. But there's a moment where Jeevan kind of is struggling a little bit. He's going through it. And he sees Lara over by the bathrooms, and he goes over and basically just hugs her. And it's this long hug where he doesn't really say much. He just hugs her because he needs to hug. He needs to feel something. And she's like, "Oh, are we hugging? Okay, yeah, you did good." And she sort of pats him, and it's nice though. It feels like someone who's been through the ringer, who is finally like admitting that he's not great, that he's not okay, that everything he's been going through is getting to him. And part of that is kind of like something else that he brought up with Kirsten, actually, is that he's starting to lose it, and he feels like she needs other kids and he needs other adults to talk to. And in this idea that, he always has to be the one who has the burden of being the one who's in charge, of being the one who's responsible for the other person. And here he gets to just be with another adult where he is like No, I get to be vulnerable here and say that I'm struggling and say that things aren't going well, that this is hard, that this is tough. I'm not responsible for you. So I can use you as a confidant as opposed to, I just, it's got a lot going on here. I think Jeevan's character is very easy to kind of like understand and sympathize with and see, where his failures lie, right? His constant fear that Kirsten preferred Frank over him, is a fault. It's this, and it may be true, but it doesn't matter really if it's true. But maybe if he brought it up, maybe if he did talk to Kirsten, maybe Kirsten could alleviate that fear. Maybe Kirsten could reassure him or something. But he never did, seemingly. When this is all over and the babies are all born and the woman, which I never mentioned actually, so the woman who was waiting for Dave that turned out to be Tyler, she died during childbirth. And maybe the hardest part of the whole birthing scene is that he has to kind of comfort her as she's in great pain. And she's scared that her child's not going to live. And that's what she's asking about. And he's saying, you're doing great, you're doing great. And he's there. He's just there. He holds her hand and he helps. But it's after Dave leaves where we see that she's lying there. Actually, no, I think maybe before he leaves, actually. They walk over to her, but she's lying there dead and they cover her up with a sheet. And again, it's kind of symbolic that Tyler, when they say, hey, do you want to see her? Do you want to see the mum before you go? He just says, there was no before, and walks out. So again, representing, he only cares about the new and not the people that were there before. So yeah, when he goes back to the cabin though, Lara offers him a ride. Terry's fixed up his jacket and gives him a new name badge that's printed from the store's name badge system that says Dr. Chaudhary on it. And obviously he's got like a fake badge that says Dr. 11 on his jacket. And it's like, hey, maybe you can be both. And obviously this also comes back to this idea that he was Dr. 11 for Kirsten when she needed a Dr. 11. And she's out looking for a new Dr. 11. In fact, when he's kind of accepting that she's gone and we see her out there, it's when the Frank that he's talking to in his head is reassuring him when she's not at the cabin and she's left the compass that Frank gave her for Jeevan if he ever comes back to know that she's moved on. It's kind of like a signal to say, yeah, I'm not coming back. I've left. I've left you behind. Like he breaks down a little bit, and Frank in his head is like, no, like you were there for her when she needed you. She'll find someone new. You have to let her go. She's good at finding people, and we see her. She's looking at a spaceman. She's looking at Dr. 11 out in the snow, and it's kind of a sweet moment. It's this idea that she'll always find the next people to be with. And the rest of her story wasn't really meant to be with him necessarily. So yeah, there's a great transition here actually where the camera is going over the frozen lake, but it becomes unfrozen before it says 20 years later. We see that he's older now. Jeevan's alive. He seems to have kids. Presumably he's the father to the first baby that was born from Lara, but also another kid named Frank, and then a daughter who's very scared that he's leaving for a couple of days, but he's going to make a house call, as they refer to it. And he promises he'll be back and makes her pinky promise that he'll see her again, and goes on his way. And then the hip hop song from the previous episode starts playing as he gets in his little kayak or whatever it is to go his little house call. Which was a nice callback because it's almost like he's finally achieved what they had in that scene, like the camaraderie that Frank and Kirsten were building that Jeevan just couldn't let himself be a part of. Like it wasn't so much that Kirsten didn't like Jeevan as much as Frank, is that Jeevan wasn't opening up and letting her in the way that Frank was. Jeevan was keeping her at somewhat of an arm's length. And now it seems like he's gotten over that. He's found this life. He's got a family. He seems much happier. Now, I don't necessarily think we're going to see Jeevan again in the finale, really. And this, and get a reunion with adult Kirsten, but I kind of want it because I kind of care a bit more about them as a pair and what they meant to each other, and the satisfaction of like him seeing that she's grown up and is strong and is okay, and her seeing that he's got a family and he's happy. I kind of want that, and I kind of want that more than I care about saving the traveling symphony. which is the biggest problem this show has, is that I could not give a shit about Tyler the Prophet and the kidnapping of the traveling symphony. It's the core thing this show has had that's been its biggest detriment, is that even when I really like an episode, I know I'm going back to that with the next one, which sucks. And I've not really brought it up until this point in this review, because I felt a bit bad last, not last episode, but the last flashback episode. I felt bad that I may have like focused on my sort of negative anticipation a bit too much than just sort of saying what the episode did well, because it mostly did things well. I tried to keep this on track of, no, this was a good solid character episode that set things up. It kept playing with the themes that the show's had the entire time, about how we, remember people or let them go. It might be making a bunch of keyboard samples out of your children before you yourself die. It might be taking your spouse's name, like their first name, like Terry did / Deborah. It might be, any number of things. Maybe speaking to the dead on the comm tower of the airport, or so like it keeps playing with these themes. It gives a happy ending to Jeevan's story. It shows that he was able to move on, and gives him a satisfying conclusion. And like I said, it's ironic that the threat of whoever was on that bike coming to get him was probably the most threat I felt on the show, which is kind of weird because the guy who stabbed Frank was clearly more threatening immediately and actually did hurt someone. But for whatever reason, because I knew something bad was coming at the end of that sort of story, it just didn't feel like, I just didn't feel the impact from it in quite the same way. Whereas here, I genuinely didn't know if this was going to lead to Jeevan's demise, or if it was going to lead to whatever new life he had. There was a genuine question as to how threatening this character was, and there was an actual intense anticipation of what was about to happen. Of course, when she took her helmet off and said, "What happened to you?" it did kind of feel like, oh, maybe it's not too bad. But then, when he first wakes up, Terry does kind of talk in a weird way, and it feels almost like, hey, you're here. This is kind of like a pregnant cult, and you're going to be stuck here now. You belong to us. And that's not what it is. Obviously, the episode then goes out of its way to show that he's not trapped there. Maybe trapped in the sense that he can't really go out and travel in the snow on his own right now. But that's it. Like, he's not, like, this is like another opportunity to help people. And of course he does. And maybe even the compass, Frank's broken compass that always points in the one direction. It's this idea that no matter what, he always ends up helping someone. Jeevan, that is, right? And what it kind of represents for him. Yeah, I think in some ways this is my favorite episode. I'd have to think about it maybe some more, but I think between just how good a lot of the individual moments are, the human moments, the absurdity of like all the pregnant women together, and like that it's just them on their own pretty much. I also think I like that while sometimes this show's tones felt a bit weird to me, and I've not necessarily liked how the post-apocalyptic feels, it feels maybe a bit too light at times. I think here, despite whatever any previous episode has done, what this place turned out to be, the situation that Jeevan ended up in and how he ended up helping people, this idea of finding a way to connect with other human beings and do something genuinely good, and this optimistic kind of vibe that it had, worked for me because there was a genuine feeling of, oh, this is where it would typically go dark if I was watching Last of Us, or I was watching like a Walking Dead style show or something. And instead, its pivot into what it was actually was quite endearing. And I felt it's wild to me just how much I wasn't really into the last episode, and then just how much I thought this nailed almost everything that it was doing and going for. It really is a show of two sides, of two wildly different qualities for me. Which is not to say that all the flashbacks have been completely perfect. There's been some nitpicks, maybe. There's maybe some things that... but honestly, the biggest thing holding them back is just knowing that I'm going back to the other stuff. So, we'll see. It's the finale next time, and I don't know what to expect from it. I understand thematically why we'll not go back to Jeevan, and why Kirsten and Jeevan won't reunite, but it's also telling that it's the only thing I really care about. And that's maybe setting me up for some disappointment in the finale. So I hope if that doesn't happen, then at the very least I'll see kind of the points that it's trying to make by the end. But given how I feel about Tyler's whole plot and everything he's been doing, uh, I just I don't know what to feel going back to him and his mom and Clark and just, where we left off last time. Yeah, we had the explosion, so we'll see how that does. Uh, yeah. Remember when there was two kid suicide bombers? Remember when that was a thing? It feels weird just how much that's not been this constant point that's brought up over and over again. It feels weird that the show's forgotten that happened. At least it feels like it does. It feels like just a lingering thing from many episodes ago now. But hey, that's my thoughts on this episode of Station 11. It was pretty damn good. Hopefully the finale can land some of this. So some of what I want from it. The good thing is though is that this was a nice ending to one character story, and it was effectively an ending to Kirsten the child story. I know she's obviously the same character as the one that we get in the present day, but there's been such a disconnect for me over caring about the kid version versus the adult version that like if I don't like the finale, I'll just think of this as being the ending. Like there's a hopeful optimism of Kirsten going on to other things and Jeevan gets his happy ending, and we can live with that. But that is me. Thank you very much for joining me. You can of course support all the content over in Patreon or YouTube membership if that's more your thing, or if you want to do a one-time thing, even a super thanks on YouTube is greatly appreciated. Any support at all keeps everything going, both on here and over in Male Fuzz Movies. But yeah, like, subscribe, all the usual YouTube things. All those things are free to do and help out too. So by all means. Otherwise, that is me. So thank you very much for joining. I'll see you in a couple of weeks for the finale to Station 11. And then we'll see what Allison takes us on to next. So thank you very much. I'll see you next time. Keep watching TV. Have you got any vanilla?